Hello, this is Case Lane, and today we're talking about how to find podcasts for you to guest interview. So these are the podcasts where you want to be on to be a guest because hopefully there's a good reason, right? Because that's going to be my first question. Why do you want to be interviewed on a podcast? And you have to think about this because we're going to think about the other side too. You're probably saying, well, I want to grow my audience, promote my business, connect with like-minded people, promote a product or a service, communicate a message, or practice public speaking, or maybe other things that you can think of. There's a reason why you want to be a guest on somebody else's podcast. But why does that host want you on their podcast? What are they thinking about? And that's something that you have to think about too. They want to provide value to their audience. They want to build a library of compelling content on their podcast. Sure, they want to grow their audience too, and maybe combining your audiences will do that. And they want to connect with like-minded people too. So meeting you and having a great conversation with you would do that. And they'd like to communicate a supportive message. Yes, maybe your message resonates and they absolutely want to make sure that it gets out there. And of course, practice interviewing as well. So what else can you think about that the host wants for their podcast when you're thinking about what you want when you want to be on their podcast, okay? So I'm going to take you through what I learned in my inadvertent podcast research project, which is not exactly an elegant name for it. I'll come up with something else. But what I set out to do was to see if I could get interviewed on podcasts as part of a virtual podcast tour for promoting my new book, Recast. So Recast, is about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, online business success, business, side hustles, solo bosses, solopreneurs, motivation, inspiration. These were all the various topics I was thinking of. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go out there and I'm just going to find some podcasts and hopefully get some interviews and be able to do this and, just see where it takes me. And I've got a message for everybody that I think is valuable and hopefully they'll have me on. And it took me down a very interesting road to start that way. The advice would tell you, okay, write a good pitch. That's the pitch for why you should be on the podcast. Contact the host and schedule the interview. Yippee, it's done. All right, so there, finished. Well, first problem. How do I find which podcast to contact? Statistics now say there's more than 1 million podcasts. So how do I find the ones that I think would make sense for my message? Problem 2. How do I know if my pitch is a good fit? How do I know if this podcast host is going to be interested in what I have to say? And problem 3, how do I find the contact information? Sure, it's great to say contact the host, but how do I find it? Where are these hosts lurking? So I had to figure this out. And it all came down to research. So you have to work through the podcast world with what I ended up calling a brute force approach to discovering the undiscoverable, which is a way to connect with the right podcasts that you could be a guest on. So the first solution is following the Google and the podcast directory search path to find podcast names. The second solution is to then use descriptions and keywords and past episodes and websites to figure out if the podcast is a good fit. And then the third solution is to find the websites and the directories and social media that gives you the contact information that you need to actually reach out to that host. Okay, so now what does all that look like? Well, here's what I ended up doing. I thought, I'd like to get, maybe 50, 100 interviews. Wouldn't that be awesome? I mean, after all, there are 1 million podcasts, right? So I should be able to find at least 50 or 100. Well, as of now, I've researched more than 1,000 podcasts, and I'm going to keep updating this over time because I'm going to keep going through this process. I found about 30% which were relevant to my subjects, and I'll talk about that. The difference between what I'll say the title and the description of the podcast might say versus what you think makes sense for you. Now, about 25% of the people I reached out to replied, and so far I've been interviewed or scheduled or maybe scheduled on about 50 shows. So I've had a positive response on about 50 shows, and I'll talk about all that also. So how do you get interviewed? Let's talk about the most fundamental thing. You have to have something to say. Podcasting is an audio medium. It's where people talk. So you've got to be prepared to speak. So have a message that's developed. It doesn't have to be polished, doesn't have to be slick, it doesn't have to be set up by a PR firm, but it does have to be viable. It has to be something that the podcast host understands that would actually make sense for their audience. Then create your customizable pitch. Do all this before you start reaching out there, because you really want to have in your mind exactly what it is you're asking them when you say you'd like to be on their show. So you can have a standard email ready, but by customizable, it means you are able to adapt it to the content of each host and show as you go through. Each time you send it, you're checking it again, you're making changes because you want to make sure it fits exactly what that host is looking for. So you're doing all of this up front because you want in your mind exactly what you're going to need to say when you go and make that pitch. Then the next really important thing is selecting your categories and keywords. Where do you think you're going to come out in this? Now, in my case, I'm looking at entrepreneurs. So that means, yes, that includes entrepreneurs, that includes solopreneurs, that includes side hustles. So think about when you've got your big ticket category, what would that include? Entrepreneurship to me includes inspiration, motivation, and action. Business includes small business, getting started in startups. Success includes personal development, self-help. So these big categories like entrepreneur or success or something like that come from the podcast directories. If you're familiar with Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or iHeartRadio or any of them, you can look and see what their categories are and then drill down from there to what you think are maybe the subcategories or the more niche genres that you would be in. But you make sure you do this again. You're doing this all up front before you start looking at podcasts. Figure out what categories you think you're in. And establish your parameters. What does that mean? Figure out the categories you're not in, even if it comes within, let's say, your kind of global category. So for example, for entrepreneur, for what I was talking about, I didn't want to be on shows that talk about just, established businesses that, have SEC filings and put out annual reports, because I'm talking to rising, aspiring entrepreneurs and solopreneurs, so it just wouldn't make sense to be on a show like that. I also didn't want to be on a show that focused on just overcoming obstacles, like that, when was this difficult? When was that difficult? Because that's also not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about getting started with an online business and how rising entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs move forward. I also didn't want to talk about specific industries. I've got my areas of expertise from my professional experience, but there's so many podcasts that are aimed at specific industries. I didn't want to do that. So these are podcasts that fell in the entrepreneur category, but they are outside my parameters, outside my fence, okay? Same with entrepreneurship. I didn't want to be on podcasts that focus on leadership or operations or spiritual entrepreneurship, things like that. Now, I'll talk about how that could be a little tricky when it comes to sort of themes like that. You're not really sure. I didn't want to talk about business corporations or finance or investing or taxes. And I didn't want to talk about corporate careers. And, I didn't want to do pure life stories. I wanted to do entrepreneurial journeys for sure, because I can talk about that myself, but not when people were talking about just sort of their life story or like health and physical challenges and so on. Not because these are not great subjects. These are all great subjects, but they didn't fit with my core message. And it's really important because, as you see, we're going to see as we get into this, there's a million podcasts to weed through. You're going to want to be able to say yes or no based on what you believe is your core message that makes sense. You don't want to be pitching to a host that's going to look at what you have to offer and say, that makes no sense for my show. Okay? Now the search really begins. Now you're going to look for podcast names. But be careful. I know a lot of people want to start with Apple Podcasts. Here's the challenge. Apple Podcasts will give you the first 100 results of a particular category. Only 100. So where's 101 to 1 million? Well, they fall down here into this very sad line that says less relevant items are not displayed. To narrow your results, use more specific search terms. So 101 to 1 million, you are the less relevant. And hey, I'm a podcast host and I don't appear in the top 100 here, so I know exactly how this feels. So Apple just kind of sort of just says, no, we're not going to show you that. But here's the problem. They tell you to use more specific search terms. So I go to my podcast. I literally put in the name of my podcast, the Ready Entrepreneur Podcast. Where do I show up? In 10th place. All right. So there's the challenge. Why do these people show up ahead of me? Because they have the word ready in the description of the episode title, right? They get the word ready, so they get to show up ahead of me, even though my show is actually called the Ready Entrepreneur Podcast. So this is the challenge with using Apple Podcasts to try and find people. Yes, you're absolutely going to find podcasts, even if you could be interviewed on, all the top 100. They're probably not all in your genre, right? So how do you get beyond that list to find all the other podcasts that are out there in the world that might want to have you on as a guest? That's what we'll get into. You need to get beyond the top 100. Directory searches are limited to the top 100, the top 200. So this project is about finding from 101 to 1 million without paying a PR organization or firm. So we're not talking about those of you that want to pay somebody to get you interviews. You can do that, obviously. We're talking about maybe you can pay someone to do this process, but this is the direct research process. We're not talking about paying for directory access, at least not yet. I'm going to talk about that a little later, how some of the directories in the time that I was doing this have changed their practices. And we're not talking about relying on matching services. That's something also that's rising up where people try and match hosts and guests. Hopefully those particular apps will become more sophisticated over time. But we're not talking about that because, for example, I'll give you one that I signed up for. I signed up as a host and as a guest. As a host, I got like 15, 20 requests, and as a guest, I got 0. So there's still a long way to go in making those viable. But this process that I used, this brute force research method, where I went through more than 1,000 podcasts, reached out to more than 300 people, got 25% replies, 50 opportunities to interview. This is what I want to talk about with you today. So the first thing you're going to do is search podcast names. Now, this first round of search is all about looking for names that might fit in the categories or the keywords that you've identified. So for me, any podcast name with the word entrepreneur in it or entrepreneurship, I wanted to take a look at. But beware, that not necessarily means you're going to capture all of the podcasts that are talking about your subjects, because the names of the show could be anything. And you never really know until you get deeper into it. But you need a place to start. So you start with the podcast name. Now, as I mentioned, the directory is not the best place to start. So I started with Google. Google search and Google Images. So you put the keyword, so for my case, entrepreneur, podcast, and just hit search and see what comes up. So you search for your keyword or category with the word podcast. Make sure you include the word podcast on the search bar, or else you're just going to get a bunch of other stuff, right? Now, Google Images I found as a surprise because I just happened to click on it and ta-da, all these images came up of podcast graphics. So that was great. So that was just an extra way to look at a bunch of different podcast names. So the next place that I ended up searching, the two directories that proved to be the most helpful were Listen Notes and TuneIn. Again, I searched for category or keyword. Both of these directories limit the number of free searches, but their list is a lot longer than Apple Podcasts. And the benefit about these two directories is that they show the podcast show email address on the show page. Now, there's different ways to get to it. So for now, as of August of 2020, you could click the email button and it would show you the email if it's there. Not every show put it there, although I must say the majority did. So if you're on, and TuneIn became more reliable than Listen Notes in terms of the free service, because Listen Notes put up a paywall or a sign-in, a login wall. I kept getting different messages, so I have to go back and see exactly what they're doing. But For sure, right now you can try. The email button is definitely there on both of those directories to check, and you just click on it. So that's why I ended up using both of those to do deeper searches as well. I also looked at Castbox. Castbox also had a longer list of accessible free listings. So you put the word entrepreneur in, and you got a long list of longer than 100 list of shows. Now, I could see everything changing as I went through this, so these are all subject to change, and I will update this video and the information in my blogs at readyentrepreneur.com. I will update as I keep going through this process so that you have the information. Okay, the other place to look, when you start researching podcasts, you will see Apple Podcasts listeners also subscribe to. You'll see listen notes, recommendations. That's a great place to check for other shows. Look at the suggested shows, see what looks similar, see what the names are, and put them down in your list. What I was doing is with each sort of big search, I would just take down all of the names of those shows before going back to individually search them, which I'm going to talk about. Another thing that came up is when your hosts have on their website their prior podcast guest appearances. So again, in my case, if I'm talking to people who host entrepreneur podcasts and those hosts have been on other shows about entrepreneur podcasts or entrepreneur related subjects, then I'd like to see what those shows are. Now, unfortunately, this is not very common. A lot of podcasters, they do guest on other shows, but they don't put the links or anything like that up on their websites. But when they do, that gives you another list of shows that you can look for and see if there's an opportunity there for you. And then finally, social media. As we go through this whole process, you're going to see I leave out social media quite a bit, largely because it's so time consuming and often unrewarding to try and find contact information. If that's what you're going for, you can do the direct contact through the social media platform, but then you've got to really keep track of it to keep going back and seeing if you have responses and so on. Also, you don't get the descriptions and some of the information about the podcast. It's hard to tell. You might, it's hard to tell. Like with the directories are consistent. Every podcast is presented exactly the same way. Social media requires a deep dive into what that particular host or show is doing. Now, that said, if you want to spend time in social media, if that's where you are anyway, if there are particular podcasters you absolutely have to talk to, then that's where you spend your time. But the process that I focus on is get an email address and use that email address to contact the host. So this is all about setting your goals. How much time do you want to spend each day? How many results do you want each day? And how long do you intend to keep searching? I started out, I thought, okay, I'm just going to reach out to 10 people a day. But it took so long to find 10, email addresses every day. It was taking like 3 hours or longer. Then I switched to 5, and then I switched to 3. Like if I was going through a lot of different podcast names, and I got 3, okay, that was it for the day if I'd already spent 2 hours. So I averaged about 2 hours a day, 7 days a week from May to August going through this process. Okay, so what was I looking for? Of course, relevant shows. Emphasis on relevant. Use the categories, the keywords, and the parameters you have set to decide what is relevant. Relevant to you and to the host, okay? Like you might think, hey, this is a great show. They've got, 10 million followers. I want to be on the show. But the host is not going to want you if it's something, that's totally not what their audience is interested in. That's where I say do all that work up front where you've got your message and you really know, because you need to weed these out. And don't be afraid to just weed out, the shows that don't look right. Because the problem is you don't want to sign up with somebody or try and, send it a pitch and it's just completely off. And you're spending time where you could be spending it with some other podcaster because that's odd. You've got 1 million to go through here, right? Sort of. Not obviously it's 1 million total, not per genre. But there's going to be a lot. You've got thousands of podcasts to go through. So if you're looking at it and you're not sure and you don't think that you connect with a particular host, just drop it. So so finding relevance. I start on the Apple Podcast page. I always check the Apple Podcast page. And the first thing I do is check the date. And it took me a little bit to figure this out. Check the date of the last episode. An astonishingly high percentage of shows get the front page, the first page of search results, but the show itself is dead. Now, my definition of dead is if they've not done an episode in the last 6 months. But, it could be like soap opera dead where they come back to life in the future. So you could decide, like if you see somebody, you could check social media. Maybe the person's active on social media, the host, but the show hasn't been recorded for a while. And maybe they're coming back. Podcasts are not like TV or radio where a show gets canceled, never to be heard from again. A podcast host can take 6 months off, no problem. Take a year off, take 2 years off, and then bring the show back. If they're paying for hosting, the old episodes are still sitting there. So I just set that date. I just set it up in my own head that if there had not been a posted show within the last 6 months, in my opinion, the show was dead and I was not going to reach out to them. And that was a very large percentage of the 2/3 of the 1,000 shows I didn't respond to. A very large percentage of them were because they were, in my opinion, dead. Okay. Also on the Apple page, you're looking at the description. You want to make sure that the description sounds like the type of show you want to be on. Again, it's never 100% clear. Some descriptions are great. Some descriptions are vague. Some use kind of words that you don't use. So you have to make a decision. Now, the decision can be that you say, you know what, I don't even understand this description, so I'm not reaching out to the show. That's fine. Remember, you can move on. You don't have to be on every show. All the people I was reaching out to are people I'd never heard of before. I'd never heard of their shows because the super famous people, of course, I don't expect that I'm going to ever hear from them. And, not ever, but someday, but not yet. So reaching out to the top 100 would probably not have been the best use of my time. The shows that I were on were all perfect, fantastic, fabulous, great matches. So you want that. And the description, though, is whatever the host or the producer says it is. And so you kind of have to just decide if you think that's right. So another reason I like using the Apple Podcast page is because they also give you the first 3 lines of the episode descriptions. And what's the first thing you're looking for? Do they do interviews? Sometimes that's in the description. It will say that they'll do interviews. So that's great. That's really helpful. But if it's not, you just take a quick look and look at the last couple episodes and see if there's any interviews there. Now, if there's no interviews, similar to this idea of being dead, like maybe they do interviews, but they haven't done any for a while. Like if you look at my podcast, you'd see that. So that's a hard call, but I would look at it. I would sometimes look just at the length of time of each show. If each show is running below 10 minutes, I'm going to assume they don't do interviews, so they just do quick commentaries, things like that. You never know. And if you're really interested in the show, it looks really cool, looks like it's totally your thing, then you might want to reach out to the host anyway. Okay, so I start there, the Apple Podcast page. If there's no Apple Podcast page, just pick another directory, whatever comes up first in search results, then look there. But again, the other directories don't give you the sort of this good overview that the Apple page gives you, the Apple Podcast page gives you. But if you're still looking for them, look. And again, I look in Listen Notes or Tune In next because they have the contact information. But before I pick an email off of one of the directories, I would definitely go for the host or show website. So when you search Google for a show, that website should come up on the first page because most people, it would be like website/podcast, right? And not always, but most of the time it should come up on the first page if there is a website. Go to the website because some hosts require you to fill out their guest podcast form on their website. So you want to check for that. Some in their regular contact page form, there will be a line that says something like podcast guests, apply here or whatever. So you want to make sure you check that. You also check the host or show website to see what the show's about. There's probably more information there. See what the host is about. You want to keep that information in the back of your mind for when you send your pitch, because you might have things in common that you want to make sure that you align with whatever the host has on their website. Okay? So you're looking for an email, but you're looking for it first on the host or show website. And if they have their own form, you're going to end up filling that out. And then the other place to check for relevance is social media, of course. Now, again, I didn't spend a lot of time on social media. I thought it was too vague for my purposes. I thought the directories provided much better information in terms of the podcast, but you might want to check and see, if there's been guest appearances lately, who's been doing it, that type of thing. So if it's a show that you really want to follow up on, then you would go to social media as well. Okay, so that's finding relevant shows. Then you're going to get that host contact information. Starting on the website, look for the podcast guest form. That doesn't exist. Look at the regular contact form. See if it says anything about podcast guests. Look for a show or a host email. I took any public email, like even if it was support at or info at or whatever. I took those because those are typically the host or the show team, and somebody will redirect the message to them, right? So if there was no email or contact information on the show website, with the exception of a general contact form that did not mention anything about podcast guests, I came back to that if I couldn't find an email anywhere. So that was my last option. Would be if the host has a contact form that's just a generic contact form and there's no email address anywhere else, then I would use the contact form. Otherwise, I would, again, so I hope I make that clear. Podcast guest form, number 1. Okay. A contact form directed at a podcast guest, number 2. A public email, number 3. Then I look for emails elsewhere. And if there's no other email elsewhere, I come back and see if there's a generic contact form that doesn't say anything else, just happens to say, contact me here. Then I go with that. Okay. As I mentioned, you can get the email address right now as of August of 2020 from Listen Notes or TuneIn. It's on the show page. I didn't see other directories that had that. They might be out there. I'll keep looking. You can also look at the RSS feed. This is interesting. This is in Listen Notes instructions, again, as of August 2020. If you want to read the RSS code, not the URL. The URL is just whatever it is. But if you look at the actual code, if you want to read through it and decipher where the email address is, you can do that. And then social media, as I mentioned, you can create a social media message. But you want to make sure you have a good process for tracking, when you sent that message, when you should check again. And you have to kind of create a new way of talking to people on social media. It has to be shorter, obviously succinct, but you still need to get your message across somehow. So I feel it's a little trickier, but for those of you that really like it, that's where you want to go. All right, now it's time to customize your pitch, okay? So remember at the beginning, a couple of things said, go onto when you're on the website, make sure you look at the host about page. Make sure you look at the background information of the show. You want to see when you're on the Apple podcast page, when you were looking at the episodes, you want to see what the tone is of the episode descriptions. How are they written? Are they written like how-tos, or are they written more spiritually, like conformings and changings and things like that? So make sure you customize your pitch to that information. That's the research that you did that then lines up with how you want to pitch your message. Make sure you change the name on your pitch, or don't include a name at all until the very last minute, okay? Do not send the next host the last host email. Look for the overlapping facts on the website. Address their audience. So if you have a generic email that says, people say this, and then it's so clear that their show is all aimed at women, change the gender to women, okay? Change it to their nickname, Fire Nation, or whatever they call their audience. Change it so that it's clear. And this is very quick and simple. And sure, you didn't spend hours doing this deep dive research, but it shows that you paid some attention to their show, what it's about, and you actually tried to customize, right? So look at their episode title style. and use the same thing when you're pitching your topics to them so that they can just then imagine your topics on their show. If they do all how-tos and then you come out with, my life's journey, they're going to be like, well, that doesn't line up with how I do my show. So you've missed a big opportunity there, okay? And then acknowledge the current environment. Now, you don't have to get political or social or anything about that. You can just say, hope all is well or whatever, because obviously we're in a very difficult time right now. You're cold reaching out to people. Maybe you're not sure if the show's even still recording, anything like that. So you just kind of want to throw out a one-liner there that acknowledges that you get that, the current environment ain't what it used to be. All right. And then send your pitch. Send it straight down the middle. Check the podcast name and the host name before you hit send. If you're not sure about spelling, copy and paste the name from the Apple Podcast page. If you're not sure what order to put co-host names in, because who knows what the sensitivity is, do it exactly how it's written on the Apple Podcast page. Make sure you name the show what it is. So if the show is, My Great Podcast Show, then just make sure you say My Great Podcast Show and not just My Great Podcast or My Great Show or something like that, because there are a lot of overlapping names in podcasts. So My Great Podcast Show and My Great Podcast and My Great Show are three different things, three different shows. So make sure you put the right name, that you're not just kind of, letting it go, pay a little bit of attention, and then track your send date just to know when you sent it, so that you can make sure if you're going to follow up or anything like that. If you can designate whatever format that you're tracking your pitches. You might want to put a line like, this is a great show, I really want this one, or something like that, so to follow up if you want to follow up later. I didn't follow up with anybody who did not reply. So if people reply, you follow up immediately. And even if it's a no, the follow-up is simply, thank you for replying, appreciate you taking the time. And you can leave it at that. And if the follow-up obviously is a yes, you follow up immediately to get on the calendar. If it's a maybe, you check what the reason is. And if it's something like our interview schedule is filled, but we want to speak again, but we're interested in what you have to say, then you reply with, great, thank you so much. I will reach out again in September or January or whatever it may be, so that you can keep that dialog box open. But again, just keep an eye on it. Now, you don't have to check your email every 5 minutes. I check, I do this process a couple hours a day. So at the beginning and the end of those 2 hour, that 2 hour window is when I'm working on those emails, and I'm not worried about, replying anybody else who comes in outside that window. If I replied to the next day, I'm not worried about that. There's not been a single one that said, I'll interview you tomorrow. So you should be okay with that. But again, you can set it up any way you want. And some people might decide you want to try and you have a shorter time frame and you want to get as many interviews as you can in a week or two. So then you're going to be on email all day long, and that's fine too. Okay. Now, there's a couple other things I want to point out. So I talked about dead podcasts. The definition of dead is mine, I decided it was 6 months, but that does not necessarily mean it is. Some podcasters take time off. Very few had a kind of a finale type of episode or a taking a break episode. That's why I started declaring them dead, because it would just be like they're a regular episode and then no more. But obviously, if you do see a finale episode or taking a break episode, you can acknowledge that. So if it says taking a break when you send your pitch, you can say, hey, when you start recording again, keep me in mind or whatever. If it's a finale, then it's a finale. You can just assume that they're not doing any more recording. Watch out for conflicting podcast names. As I mentioned, there are so many that are conflicting. Got kind of funny sometimes, the different variations and versions. I'll put that detail. I didn't want to call out any one podcast or podcast name, but there was a couple that did really generate like 10 or 12 versions of what turned out to be all different separate podcasts. And I might put that in the blog so people could see just what that means. But that means for you as somebody looking for an interview, make sure you're very careful. Put down the correct podcast name and make sure your pitch goes to the right name and the right person. Some of the podcasts will have a name and then it'd be like The Thing with so-and-so, and that's the full name of the podcast. Whereas the thing is one podcast, and The Thing with so-and-so is a different podcast. So make sure you don't mix them up, because I'm sure both sides know that they have that, that issue, right? Okay. Big thing, requests for payments, reviews, or interviews. This is 100% up to you how you want to respond. This was not common, but it does happen that there are people who will request payment, everything from an application fee to a payment for interviewing. There are some that request reviews, that they won't consider your request, or they won't even they wouldn't consider your request without seeing reviews first, and then or doing interview for interview. All those kind of requests are up to the podcaster. The great thing about this industry is the great variety of people that are involved in it, the diverse voices, the different things that people are doing. Everything says something about who they are, and I hope that everybody takes their stand on exactly who they want to be and what they want to represent. So whatever people ask, you just take it or leave it. It's up to you. If you're requesting an interview and you can look at it and get they want they want reviews, payments, whatever, and you just decide that's not my thing, and then you just say no, and that's the end of it. So you just decide. You make up your mind about what you think about that, and then just respond based on setting whatever you think are your values around that. And then the most important thing, no replies is perfectly normal. So 3/4, 75% did not reply. That's perfectly normal. I think it's actually quite refreshing in the sense that, don't say anything at all. You're not interested, just ignore it. You can expect that a lot of the popular podcasters get hundreds and thousands of requests for interviews. So they're probably not, I don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're looking at them, maybe they're not. But it's don't worry about that. Now, obviously, if there's somebody you just absolutely love, you think they're fantastic, you just have to be on the show, it's the greatest thing ever, then there are other things that you can do to get their attention. That's when you become big with them on social. That's when you start sending them different emails, pitching them really helpful things, like maybe related to their business, their website, something like that. So that's a different process if there's somebody you really, really, really want to interview you. But for everybody else where you're not really sure, you just thought that the podcast looked like a good fit, you thought that there was a lot of potential there for your message, then if they don't reply, you just have to accept it. Okay? So that covers how to get your interview, how to find the podcast that may be interested in interviewing you. So coming up in the video series, I'm going to have how to be a welcoming podcast interview host, where I'm going to take a deeper dive into some of these issues that come up around, when you're a guest trying to get on a podcast and what you're going to see. I'm going to talk about how to be a valuable podcast interview guest and how you can improve your pitches and make yourself somebody that they want to talk to. I want to talk about what I really learned about the podcast industry and video 4. That's going to be going a little bit beyond this issue of dead podcasts and things like that. And then in video 5, I'm going to cover how to advance your life by listening to podcasts. I think one of the things I discovered is just so many great interviews that are going on, again, with numbers 101 through 1 million, just really so many interesting things that people are talking about. So how do you as a listener find all this information and really get an opportunity to enjoy it? So that's what's coming up in the next few videos. Please subscribe so that you'll know when they're going to be available. Or continue to come back and check for them. So I'm Case Lane. I'm the founder of Ready Entrepreneur. I'm the host of the Ready Entrepreneur podcast. I'm a writer, the author of Recast, which is my most recent book, which you can get now. It's on Amazon and in Kindle Unlimited. I'm a blogger. I'm a coach. So come on over to readyentrepreneur.com and check out all the information that I have there. Would love to connect with you there. And you can find me on social at Ready Entrepreneur HQ, at Case Lane World, at Ready Entrepreneur. Reach out, say hello on the different social media, and please send me your questions that you have around podcasting, being a host, being a guest, being a listener, and what you're looking for, what you think is missing, and how I can help you figure out, the information that you really need. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.